Okay, so Tu B'Shvat is often called the not just birthday of trees, but also sort of the Jewish environmental holiday. So I thought we would talk a little bit about the environment, and in fact look at some of Judaism's environmental concerns, which in many respects I think foreshadows and precedes sort of the general world's interest in the environment. It's actually fairly cutting edge, I think, in terms of if you think about the times in which these laws are written. And so we're going to look at Jewish environmental law, just sort of a broad overview. We'll look at a lot of the different sources, but there's many, many more. And what I'd like to show really is that Jewish environmental law is very similar in many respects to general concern, secular concern with the environment, but there are at least two major differences in Jewish environmental law. We're going to hopefully see those two major differences and the impact that these two major differences have also in our daily lives. The prism, or the initial prism through which we'll look at Jewish environmental law, here you go, there's sources right here. The initial prism that we're going to look at Jewish environmental law is and you can give one to Shlomo as well, maybe. There's 2 pages, 4 sides. So in honor of Tu B'Shvat, we're going to do Jewish environmental law. The prism through which we're going to look at this is the very well-known mitzvah, Bal Tashchit, the mitzvah of not destroying. But in order to really understand what Bal Tashchit is all about, because what I'd like to suggest is the way most of us understand the mitzvah of Bal Tashchit is incorrect, or I should say incomplete. We understand that we're not allowed to waste or destroy things wantonly, but what I'd like to argue is that there's a deeper sort of philosophical understanding of this mitzvah, of not to waste, that really sort of underpins everything that Judaism is trying to get at when it comes to talking about the environment. And so in order to get that, we're going to look at 3 different areas of Jewish environmental law, and the first 2 will sort of foreshadow the last thing we get to. So let me start with a general introduction, which is the mitzvah of Bal Tashchit itself, which if you look on the first page says Judaism and the environment, and part 1 is sort of philosophical ideas behind it. We're not yet getting to the law, but we'll get to the law in just a moment. And if you look at the 4th source there, the Sefer HaChinuch itself, many of you perhaps have seen this. It's quite a beautiful idea, I believe. He says that we are not to destroy fruit trees when we encircle or create a siege around the city. When you go out to war, very often a siege will be part of that war. And you might think that you want to sort of destroy as much as possible. You want to take the enemy's fruit trees, the enemy's water, all these different things. And the Torah prohibits us from destroying fruit trees. You're not allowed to take out your vengeance against the trees themselves. That's considered Bal Tashchit. That's considered wasteful. From that,
You need the wood.
what?
Oh, the war effort. What if there's only 3 trees and you need wood for the war effort?
It's an interesting question of whether or not you can use the wood or not. We're going to see this a little bit more in a little bit. In general, there's a difference of opinions. There are some who say, and you'll see this in the Sefer HaChinuch, it says, that says the mitzvah itself is fruit trees, and we can extend it to include everything else. We can extend it to include trees that are not fruit trees. We can extend it to include all material items that you're not allowed to waste. The most famous line, if you look at the second line in section A, I'm going to answer your question. I just want to put a little more sources into it. What's included in this prohibition? Shelo la'asot shum hefsed. You can't do any type of waste whatsoever. Kagon lisrof or likroa beged, like tearing a garment or burning a garment, or to break a vessel, like pots or pans, to throw them away, to waste them, to destroy them, to break them. And then, as I said, the famous line is in the next paragraph. Shorish mitzvah yadua, the root of this mitzvah is well known. Shehu kidei lilmod nafshenu le'ehov atov, in order to teach us to love the good and all the benefits and to cling to them. Mitokach tidabak banu hatova, that we should cling to that which is good and distance from that which is bad. And what is bad is anything that is wasteful. V'zehu derech hachasidim, and this is the way of the righteous people. V'anshe maaseh oavim shalom, the righteous people and those who are lovers of peace, and smechim b'tov, and rejoice in the good of creation, and they bring others to Torah. Right, this is obviously a very desirable type of person. V'lo yovdu afilu gerger shel chardal. The real tzaddikim, the real chasidim, the people who love Torah, who bring others closer to Torah, they wouldn't even waste a small seed of mustard. Everything has a use. They wouldn't waste it whatsoever. We're going to see the details of what this includes in a little while. But what I want to show here is that the Sefer Chinuch assumes this mitzvah is very expansive. It starts with the fruit tree, and it expands to everything else. It's a way of life, right? It's an entire perspective of life. Others are more restrictive and say it's specifically a fruit tree. So therefore, if you need the wood, and you can get the wood from a non-fruit tree, you're allowed to cut it down, and you could use it for war. But you can't touch the fruit tree itself. But you could use it for other things. Now, there's a third way of looking at this as well, and that's what I want to get to at the end. So this is a general view of the mitzvah of Baal Tashchit. It's a way of life. I'm going to expand on this a little bit and sort of broaden our focus not just on this particular mitzvah, but about the laws in Judaism that have to do with the environment in general, and introduce those general laws with sort of some philosophical points. And those are the first midrashim. The first midrash on the page at the very top, Kohelet Rabbah, is also a fairly famous one, and you may begin to sense where Judaism is the same and where Judaism is different in the modern environmental movement. After the comma, on the first line, B'sha'ah shebarah HaKadosh Baruch Hu et Adam HaRishon, from the moment, or at the moment that God created the first human being, Natlu v'achziru al aleinei Gan Eden, he went and showed him all the trees that are in Gan Eden. And V'amarlo, and he said to him, Re'ei ma'aseh kama na'im u'meshubachim. Look how beautiful the works, my works of creation are, and pleasant and glorious they are. V'kol ma shebarati bishvilcha barati. And you should know that everything I created for you. Ten datcha shelo tikalkel. Pay attention, set your mind that you will not destroy the tachriv, or you should not ruin and you should not destroy my world. She'im kilkalta, because if you end up spoiling it, ein mi sheyetaken acharecha. There's no one who can come after you who can repair it. In that line, I think you see two fundamental principles of Jewish environmental ethic. One of them is, and this is where we differ then, I would say the modern environmental movement, which is very much into the concept of almost not just celebrating nature, but worshiping nature. Who's at the top of this pyramid in terms of concerns for nature? I would say in the secular world, the top is the environment. Be concerned about the environment. Here, who's at the top? Well, certainly Hashem, that's correct. And then man. I created all this for you. All this environment, all these good things and beautiful and trees and fruits. It's not as an end unto itself that these are wonderful, beautiful things that need to be protected. They're for you. But the second element, and this is where we are very similar, is you have a responsibility now to protect it. It's not just you can do with it whatever you want, even if it's for you. But you still have to take care of it as a result. Yes? Exactly, it's for human beings. This is, I think, a chiddush, and we're going to see it developed in the halacha as well. The second source, B'midbar Rabbah. This is just a general sort of perspective that's connected to Baal Tashchit. It's connected to humility. It's connected to simplicity. It talks about where was the Torah given. The Torah was given in three things. It was given in fire at Mount Sinai. It was given in water. Torah is compared to water. And it's also given in the desert. Why is Torah given in the desert? Well, just as the desert is free, it's open to all, it's lowly, it's simple, so too is Torah. Torah is designed to be for those who are simple. They don't have necessarily fancy tastes. You can't buy wisdom, just like you can't buy a desert. Well, at least in this understanding, you can't buy the desert, and it's open to everyone. Okay, so it's just a general perspective in that regard. The Ibn Ezra adds one additional point, which I think also very much foreshadows the modern environmental ethic. If you look at he's talking about our responsibility with God and heaven and things along those lines. And he talks about what does it mean to have a meluchat Hashem, a kingship of God. The Perush for human beings on the last line, the third line of that Ibn Ezra says, B'chol mashallah rak Perush natan livnei adam, that God gave it to human beings, livnei adam, she'adam kamo pakid, that a man is, or a person is supposed to be a pakid. A pakid is like a picadon. God gave us the earth as a deposit, right? We spoke about a few weeks ago about being a shomer, right? When someone gives you their item, you have to watch over it, and you have certain responsibilities. So that's how the Ibn Ezra understands it. The earth was given to us. It's not ours, but it's ours in the sense that we're responsible for watching over it. Okay, so those are some just general principles. Now, what I would like to do is I'd like to look at 3 areas of environmental law. The first one is pollution control. These are, by the way, topics that I've taken from just general environmental law, but you'll see how they apply in Jewish law. Pollution control, allocation of space, and then nature I put conservation. It's a typo. This last one, nature conservation, is going to be when we return to Baal Tashchit. But to really understand Baal Tashchit, these first 2 are going to each introduce a new idea that shows us how Judaism is different than the modern environmental movement, even though it has very similar concerns. Okay, so we're going to look at a lot of sources. The first one is pollution control. So what's pollution? In the modern world, what's pollution? What are you... What? Rubbish, right? We don't want garbage, okay? Clean air, clean water, right? There's noise pollution also. Damaging the environment, okay? These are all things that Chazal was interested in as well. That you're not allowed to create a damage to the environment. You're not allowed, whether it's creation of noise, creation of smoke, creation of dust, smells are also a form of pollution. Chazal was sensitive to all of these. So I'll just give a couple of examples. The first one from the Talmud Bavli, Bava Kama. We saw a little bit of this actually when we were talking about the laws of damages. Tanu Rabbanan, Chasidim Harishonim, the early Chasidim, they would matzni'im tzotehem, zchutehem. They would hide their thorns and their glass, betoch sadot, in the midst of their fields, at least 3 tvachim down. Why would you hide something? You have garbage. What are you going to do with it? So in those days, they didn't have a dump to bring it to. So you have this glass. They would make sure to put it 3 tvachim under the ground. Why did they do that? Not to bother that when someone would come and plow, that they would plow up these things, because they understood it could be a danger to people if you have the glass, and it's also a form of pollution in that regard. Rav Sheshit, he says that's not enough. He would go and throw it into the river. Now this creates another problem, I understand, about clean water, but his incentive was to get it out of the way so it doesn't cause damage when people are plowing. Rava says, no, I would throw it into a fire to get rid of it all, to destroy it completely. But in all these cases, you see they have a responsibility to try to get rid of it. When he throws it in the river, it wasn't because he was lazy. He schlepped it down to the river. He thought that was the best, even if it wasn't, in fact, the best. Amar Rav Yehuda, and this is just a general principle, and this we did see before. Hai man debai lemiyu chasida. What is the most important set of rules you should learn if you want to become a chassid? This we once spoke about. So one answer is l'kayim mile de nizikim. Learn all the laws of nizikim, of damages. What not to do to another person, how to cause damages to them. Rabbi Amar mili davot. He says you should learn. Rabbi says you should learn Pirkei Avot. You want to become a good person? You want to become a chassid? Learn Pirkei Avot.
Absolutely.
So you agree? You agree with Rabbi, but not everyone agrees with that. right? Some say Nezikim is more important than Avot.
Pirkei Avot is in Masechet Nezikim, in the Mishnah.
Good point. The Imrei La, others say, learn brachot. Right? So what might be the argument between brachot and avot? Brachot might be that the position is,
It's also Masechet Mishnah.
well, no, but it's not Nezikim. Brachot,
Brachot is also Masechet.
yeah, it's also Mishnah. So they're saying if you only have a little amount of time, and you can only learn one section, what should you learn if you want to become a chassid? Some say just learn Pirkei Avot. Some say learn brachot, which is sort of, let's say, more between our relationship with God. Some say learn the mitzvot dealing with damages in general. One of my favorite lines from Musar, of course, is, what does Musar tell you? That if you only have 5 minutes to learn Torah every day, you should learn Musar. Why? Because after you learn 5 minutes of Musar, you'll learn that you have a lot more than 5 minutes a day to learn Torah. The other ones won't necessarily push you in that same regard. Okay. Yes. Musar is translated usually as ethical teachings, but it's a movement that existed, started really in the 1700s and really very strong in the 1800s, and it was a focus on the moral and ethical principles found within Judaism, and make sure that it's not just done ritual or through the halachas done through rote, but take out how it's going to affect you as a human being. And so it's a series of books. It's a real movement. Rabbi Israel Salant is perhaps the founder, one of the founders of the Musar movement, and it's really to encourage us to behave much better in that regard. And so that's why I say there are Musar books that will try to get you to say you can learn more Torah. You can, if Chassidut was about to sort of encourage you through love, right? Wow, we can get closer to God if we learn this extra Torah. Musar was like, you can do it because, there's two forms of Musar. There's the Musar me'ava, of love. You could do it because you're created in the image of God and you should be able to do much more. And there's also Musar from yira, from fear, saying, you're a lowly human being, nothing in front of God. You better save yourself by learning more. Rambam. If you look at the next source on the Rambam, Misha asa goren betoch shelo. If you open up a threshing floor, a threshing business, meaning where you sort of take crops and you sort of get rid of the chaff so there's a problem with that, because what happens when you do that? Things go airborne. When you're doing all this type of work, you now are putting something into the air. Or you build a bathroom, beit kisei. You build a bathroom. Or your work, o malacha sheyesh ba avak va'afar, or your work, whatever your work is, produces dust and ashes. And similarly, tzarich laharchik kedei shelo yagia ha'afar or reach beit kisei or ha'avak lechavero shelo yaziku. You have to be very careful that when you build your business, whatever it is a certain distance away from your neighbor, so that whatever you're doing, which you have a right to do, does not affect your neighbor. Whether it's you open a bathroom, whether you have a business that has dust or things along those lines. And we don't necessarily need to see it inside now, but you should know the Gemara talks about what that distance is. You're not allowed to put your your work room at the corner of the border of your property, where a wind will instantly bring it to your neighbors. You have to make sure it's at least 50 amot if you have that space. And very often, there are sources that say, if you don't have that space between your workhouse and your neighbors, you're not allowed to build that in that area. It's just not enough room because it does cause damage to others. You're beginning to get a sense, by the way, what are the rabbis really concerned with here that's different than, let's say, regular general environmental concerns? How it affects your neighbors. Look at the Rambam, by the way. What's the title of the section we're learning when we're dealing with the laws of the environment? Shchenim, neighbors. It's not Hilchot Ichut HaSviva, the environment. It's you have a relationship with your neighbors. That's what's important here. So you see the first major, I think, distinction between Judaism's concern with the environment is that it's really very much connected to our relationship with other people. We'll see that it's also concerned about environment in and of itself. But the real innovation that Judaism brings is that it's an ethical element, environmentalism, and it's concerned with people who you live with right next door, that you shouldn't create a smell. Shouldn't create, we did some air pollution with the dust and smell pollution with the bathroom. You'll see other ones, for example. Well, let me add one more element to the air pollution, and then we'll see some other things. On the back of that page, Kol ha'harchakot, all these things that you have to distance, right? Things that you're required to distance from your neighbors. Hamorot b'prachim shel mala im lo herchik v'ra'ah chaviro v'shatak harei zeh machal. If your neighbor sees you building something, and he doesn't care, he basically says, you know what, it's not going to bother me. He sees that you're building a factory that's going to produce dust, and he doesn't care. So then he can't, a year later, say, you know what, it does really bother me, remove it. That's in general. But then he goes on and says there are certain things that we have what we call in modern American law strict liability, or absolute liability, meaning you're going to always be responsible if you decide to engage in this type of behavior. So even a year later, 2 years, even if he agreed to it, your neighbor, a few years later, he wants you to remove it, he has the right to ask you to remove it because there's strict liability. So if you see the next line, yes?
It says in the halacha that when people who make write Sifrei Torah or tefillin or mezuzot, they use dog excrement. So that's an example of, they use to make, it's in the halacha, they use dog excrement to make Sifrei Torah, tefillin, and mezuzot.
We're going to see a little bit about the sofer, how he's actually discriminated against, a stam sofer, a person who's writing tefillin, in just a moment. So what are we talking about? The third line in the middle. Bashar nizikim chutz me'arba minei min nizikim. In all type of damages, except these 4 particular nizikim, Eila ha'amurim b'perek zeh, shehem daled, and the 4 are that are what we call our strict liability. Ashan, smoke, if whatever you're doing produces smoke. Reach, a smell from the bathroom smell, right? Sewage, basically. Dust, and things that are similar, and affects the earth. It makes the earth shake. This would be, by the way, it's a big issue in upstate New York nowadays with fracking. You know what fracking is? Oil fracking is you shoot in chemicals or water into the ground underneath, and you're able to get the oil that is sort of connected to the rocks to release it. And there's an advantage to shooting this in on an angle. It produces better oil if it's done in that regard. But also what's interesting is New York State prohibits fracking. Pennsylvania allows it. And they border one another, and they have the exact same type of rocks. And so what some people have done is they're in Pennsylvania, and they put their machines on an angle to go into the New York border. And also people do this, and they go into their neighbor's border. So that would be prohibited. You can't create problems with the earth in your neighbor's property. These are 4 absolute damages that a person has a right to ask you to remove at any point in time. And you see the last line, or second to last line, Lefisha ein dato shel adam sovelet nezek, that a person can't give away his right not to be bothered by these type of damages. The Shulchan Aruch further speaks about these type of damages. Interesting, you'll notice the category that he's talking about environmentalism is niskei shchenim, the damages that neighbors do to us. And he says in the first line, if there's a house, that house also has a roof, and there are 2 people in it. Lo yaseh bal habayit tanur. You can't put an oven unless you have a certain distance between the top of your oven and the next floor, because the smoke that's produced, the heat that's produced, and vice versa. You can't have an oven up below unless there's a distance below, because you might cause damages to the other person. The next source, Rambam Hilchot Melachim. Va'asor lafnot b'toch ha'machaneh. This is now a different area. It's forbidden to relieve yourself, right? To go to the bathroom inside the camp, right? Now we're talking about when Bnei Yisrael are traveling and they had their camps. or in the field, in any place you want. Rather, it's a mitzvah. Ela mitzvah taseh letaken sham derech miyuchedet lifnot ba. That you should create a proper place, a sewage system. You should create a sewage system. There's a big fight, actually, not too far from here regarding sewage, and it's all about politics. There's a couple of Palestinian villages that are not connected to any sewage system whatsoever. And the Jerusalem municipality has said, this is a danger to your children. There's raw sewage running through the Kidron Valley, right after we see the Kidron, it then goes through some of these Palestinian villages. It's raw sewage. There's not really a river there except in the wintertime. And it's raw sewage, and when the winter rushes all these things and Pampers and sewage, all terrible stuff. And the Jerusalem municipality has said, we've got to do something. We'll hook you up to our sewage and you'll have pure water. They said, no, we don't want to be hooked up to the Jerusalem municipality. So Europeans came in, and they said, we'll create your own sewage plant outside of the Jerusalem municipality. The Jerusalem municipality was not for it, but they accepted it. But then you had a new problem. What was the new problem? They were going to create all this positive water, this clean water, that would then rush down, going down towards the Dead Sea. As its way down towards the Dead Sea, who does it benefit? There's a number of Jewish settlements, Yeshuvim, that have, like, for example, date palms and stuff like that, and they were going to benefit from the water. So the Palestinian Authority then says, we don't want that either, because we don't want to have these normalization with them. So actually there was, beneath the scenes, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Jordanians actually created a system to allow there to be, it was funded by the Europeans, everything like that, and the Yeshuvim, the settlements, said, we will not touch the water. They actually stepped forward and said, it's important that their people not have raw sewage. We will not touch the water if that will solve the problem. And everyone worked out a solution. And then, this was a number of years ago, and then the Israeli, Sylvan Shalom, who was the environment or something along those lines, said we've worked this out. And we worked together with the Palestinian Authority in like a European conference. And the Palestinian Authority got embarrassed that they were caught working together to benefit their people with Israelis, and they pulled out of the deal. And so now there's still there's the raw sewage that's going through there as a result of politics. Anyway, so there's another concern, obviously, that you have to make sure that you have proper sewage. You have to do it. By the way, we know, and who's responsible to make sure that there's proper sewage? Who are the people responsible? We actually have a Tosefta, the next source, that tells us the Beit Din that would actually go out and do this. It's not just a public works project. There's a certain element of holiness. There's a religious value in this. The Tosefta next source, Maseket Shkalim, right? It speaks about the things that the people had to do at certain times of the year, right? Getting ready for Purim, getting ready for Pesach. There's going to be a lot of visitors come to Jerusalem and traveling in Pesach. So already a month before, Chamisha Asar ben Shluchei Beit Din, the Beit Din would send out Yotzin v'chofrim borot. They would go out and they would dig wells and holes and caves, umatkinim, and they would fix all the mikvaot and all the canals, water, and all the other mikvah, all the different forms of water that were needed for Jewish life. And it's interesting, they connect here in the same sentence, the mikvaot, meaning the mikvah that people needed to purify themselves, and the other canals that were needed in order to push the sewage along. These were viewed as equally important obligations of the Beit Din. Okay, I could go on, and you see we have a lot of different sources here. I just want to see if I want to hit anything else. I guess we could do this next one. The Rambam, Hilchot Tamidim. Even in the world of religious practice, you also have to be careful. What's the case here described? The case here is, after you have the karbanot in the Beit HaMikdash, you have ashes from all of these sacrifices. What do you do with it? So there was a responsibility of Kohanim to take those ashes outside of the city and they had to take them outside of the city to a place where they were protected. And the Meiri says you had to make sure that they were a place where there was not a lot of wind, because the wind would blow the ashes, and they would go to other places and disturb people. You had to make a place that it was not close to a body of water, because what would happen? The water would take the ashes and spread them throughout. You had to be very careful and sensitive to these things as well. This is also, by the way, a modern environmental problem we have. I don't know if you've noticed in the streets of Jerusalem. Have you seen recently that when they repave sidewalks, they've not been using cement, but rather they've been using bricks? Have you seen this at all? The reason why is when the first rains come, if you have just a cement, just a pavement, what happens is none of the water goes into the ground. It all is pushed along. It means it's also pushed along with all of the dirt that is built up over the previous year when the first rains come, and it takes all of these pollutants to the rivers, right to the canals, the rivers, and eventually go to the Dead Sea, if you're in Jerusalem, and other rivers if we're in different parts of Israel. So what they started doing is putting bricks, and the bricks, have sand in them in between, and what happens is the water and some of the garbage can sort of stop and sink into the ground there, and only the pure water actually makes it further down the road. Less water makes it, but more pure water. Mishnah Masechet Bava Batra. This is where we're going to get to sound pollution, concerns of sound pollution. Lo yiftach adam chanut shel nachtumim v'shel tzvaim. A person's not allowed to open up a bakery or a color, like I guess where he dyes, yarn and things along those lines. Tachet oto, beneath the storehouse of his neighbor. Velo refet bakar, and you can't open up a refet, where cows are, animals, because of the waste also, with the smell there. And a person can protest. If you start opening up a business, he can say to you, Eini yechol lishon, I can't sleep at night, mikol, from all of the people who are coming in and out of the store. If a person opens up a store next to you, the person can complain, say this is not right. However, he cannot protest if a person makes a little bit of noise with their hammer and they're grinding things. Meaning if a person's shop has people coming in and out from the outside, they can protest. But if a person has just his workshop and he makes noise there and he's been there already for a long time, you have to let him do that because it's only during work hours. But it's people coming from the outside, becomes more problem. That's the next source, which is an interesting thing, which gets back to your point about the sofer. People live in a courtyard, and someone opens up a doctor's office or another type of office, or it says even a teacher to teach children. You're allowed to protest because of all the extra traffic of people coming in and out and everything like that. So someone questioned and say, wait a second. There was a takana of Ezra who said that, Yoshua ben Gamla, it used to be that every father was responsible for teaching his children Torah. If the children didn't make it to teach their children, if the father wasn't able to teach them Torah, so then the Beit Din in each major city would teach a child when it got to age 16 or 17 what they needed to know. Yoshua ben Gamla said, no, we have to have many more teachers, and we have to start at age 6. He really was the first one who pushed the concept of universal mandatory education. Yoshua ben Gamla. What? Okay. Yoshua ben Gamla, though, who says it's the obligation of the community, not the parents. Obligation of the community. If a father or mother can't teach their child by a certain age, 6, you have to have schools where children can learn. And so the Gemara asks, wait a second. So if a person opens up a school or opens up and there's now kids' noise, can we really prevent that? And the Gemara goes back and forth. It says you could prevent it of any other learning, like if it's non-Jews who are coming to learn something else, or if it's Jews who are coming to learn but not the minimum amounts that they need. You could prevent them because of the noise, but if it's actually stuff they need to learn, you can't prevent them in this case. However, it says if the person is a sofer, he writes Torahs or mezuzot or that you can stop. People are coming in because he could do that somewhere else. people are coming in and making noise, the people in the courtyard could say, we don't want you to open such a business because it will create too much noise. The only exception is children learning Torah, you can't protest against them. But you see that there's a very high level of concern for protection of noise pollution. Again, though, it's all under the rubric of shchenim, of damages you might cause your neighbors. One last source in this field of pollution, the last one, the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Bava Kama. This is what I was mentioning, the decree of Ezra. When Ezra returned, he said there are 10 things that we're going to insist regarding Jerusalem. Aser Dvarim Nemru b'Yushalayim. These 10 things were said about Yerushalayim. Ein habayit chalut ba. When you sell a house in Yerushalayim, when you sell a house outside of Yerushalayim, a person who sells it has a year to regret selling it, and they can come back and they can buy it back from you within a year. In Yerushalayim, the person can always come back, right? Even the year, there's not a limit of a year. A person regrets that they sold the house in Yerushalayim, they can come back 5 years later and say, I made a mistake, I want to redeem it. This would create a lot, this is like almost like the church land problems here in Yerushalayim. Create a lot of problems, but obviously the concern is that a person's connection to Yerushalayim is so powerful, so great, we give them a little bit of extra leeway. Only Yerushalayim. Right, not the other walled city, it's 1 year. Yerushalayim is special. It's interesting. So then it would possibly go back to what we had said previously about unjust enrichment, which is he may have the right to get the house back, but any benefit that you've given to the property, you have the right to recoup that investment. So he would have to buy it, plus if it went up in value, he'd have to pay you potentially the difference in that regard. And there's a machloket of whether or not he has to pay the new value of the house because you made an improvement, or what your cost was to make that. Sometimes there's a difference, right? They always say about houses that when you put in a new kitchen or a new bathroom, the house value goes up significantly. But if you do other renovations, you don't ever recoup your value of what you put in. Right. So that's true. Also this true. And by the way, the Rambam actually speaks about that in environmental law as well. About if you find, which Rambam I wanted to show. It's an interesting Rambam. Maybe we'll see it in the next section actually. We'll hold off for that in a moment. Okay. I'm sorry? No. I haven't heard of it. I think it would cause incredible havoc in the real estate market if you had that there. So I haven't seen that. But this is, as far these were statements that the rabbis were trying to impress upon us the importance of Yerushalayim. In fact, there's another one. The statement's not here. It appears in a different Gemara. It's one of my favorite Gemaras. It says that accountants were not allowed to have their offices in Yerushalayim. Why were you not allowed to have an office in Yerushalayim if you're an accountant? It says that when people would go to their accountants, it says the monim, those who counted money, people would get depressed because they thought they had more money than they had. And we don't want you to be sad in Yerushalayim. So if you're going to get bad financial news, you should be outside of Yerushalayim when it happens. And then when you have good financial news, you can come back in. By the way, this idea of being sameach in Yerushalayim runs throughout the Gemaras in a whole series of different halachot. For example, Birkat Kohanim. Shlomo, this is relevant for you. A Kohen is supposed to be in a state of simcha when he gives his bracha. And if he can't give his bracha and simcha, he's not supposed to give it. So where do we see that law more than anywhere else? In a house of mourning. In a house of mourning, in general, a Kohen does not get up to duchen. He doesn't duchen because there can't be simcha in that house of mourning. The exception is, Minhag Yerushalayim is that in Jerusalem, even when you're in mourning, you still have some degree of simcha because you're living in Yerushalayim, so we still have the Kohanim go up to duchen and bless in Yerushalayim, even during a Shiva house. Not everyone home.
You have simcha when the Arabs control Har Bayit.
That's because you're in Yerushalayim.
But they control Har Bayit. We gave it to them, practically.
Listen, you can.
I mean, that's the reality.
Let me tell you something.
Moshe Dayan gave it to them.
Exactly. Let's leave politics out for just a moment, but I want to just say something philosophically. Philosophically, if you have a child who is 85% doing the things that you want them to do, and 15% not doing the things you want to do, you still have a lot of simcha and nachas in that child. Okay, so there's still a lot of simcha. That's what the halacha is trying to teach us, is even if Yerushalayim is not ideal, you're sitting in mourning. There's still an element of simcha. You always have to be able to be modeh on the tov. You always have to be able to recognize the good, even if you're not completely happy.
Very difficult. Very difficult.
Listen, life is not always simple. Other examples of Yerushalayim. This is going to get to the environment, but you don't bring the egel arufa. The egel arufa is the halacha that if there was a person who was found murdered and you don't know who did it or the distance, you would have this whole ceremony. You don't do that in Yerushalayim. There's all these things you don't do in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim can never be made in Ir Nidachat is a city where the whole city becomes idolatrous and you have to destroy the city. You can never do that with Yerushalayim. It doesn't become impure through leprosy in Yerushalayim. You're not allowed to have, this also is not an application as far as I know, you're not allowed to create mirpasot, balconies, off of your homes in Yerushalayim. I think the concern was not that it creates like an extra property and maybe people get hurt. I think it was connected to issues of purity, that you created an ohel, and we're trying to avoid as many tents as possible in Yerushalayim. That was them. And then this is the relevant part. The Ein osim ba ashpatot. You're not supposed to have garbage dumps in Yerushalayim. You're not allowed to have furnaces in Yerushalayim. This is perhaps a surprising one. The Ein osim ba ganot upardasot. You're not allowed to have public parks and orchards, except for the ones chutz meganot vradim, except for the rose parks. They used to have rose parks with roses that were in the time of the early prophets. Yes?
When you say Jerusalem was declared, what does that consist of? Is that just within the order?
There wasn't beyond. This is from the top. No. So what were first of all, we understand the first two. You're not allowed to have garbage dumps, you're not allowed to have furnaces, right? It would ruin the nature of Yerushalayim. It's supposed to be a beautiful city. So here, again, you're talking about creating a quality of life. And that's going to be our next point, very significantly. Environmentalism is also about quality of life, but for whom, right? It's also about connecting to God, because it had laws of purity and impurity. Why not orchards? Why can't you have orchards? I think in those days, in order to create orchards in some of these public parks, you had to fertilize them, and it created a very strong smell. And so you did it they already existed, you kept them, but you didn't add new ones.
What if you want to plant the etrog trees for sukkahs? That's for a mitzvah.
It's for a mitzvah. So the question is, again, listen, it's very important to remember. You're not allowed to do a mitzvah if it causes pollution for your neighbor. So if you wanted to have an etrog tree,
Everybody needs etrogim on sukkah.
so I'm telling you, the halacha is as follows. If you could put your etrog tree 50 amot away from your neighbor, such that when you fertilize it, the smell does not reach your neighbor, then you could do it. If the only way you can have an etrog tree is, today it's not a problem, you can create fertilizer that doesn't smell. But in the time of the Talmud, the fertilizer smelled, and if putting fertilizer on your etrog tree meant that it caused your neighbor to go through pain, you're not allowed to build an etrog tree. Have an etrog tree. That's a halacha. I mean, it's remember, there's ritual, and there's ethical mitzvot, and the Torah doesn't distinguish. The same God that says, have etrog for Sukkot, is the same God that also says, don't damage your neighbor's quality of life. It's the same God. Okay, let's move to the second. Right? I said there are three categories, and I'm going, yes?
What about visual pollution? Like you put an edge and you are facing the privacy.
Yeah, very good. So I didn't put that here, but that also does exist. Actually, the famous line is from, there's a famous Rashi when it describes on the phrase, Ma tovu olecha Yaakov, when Bilam is trying to curse the Jewish people, and he looks at the vast camps of the Jewish people, and he blesses them and says, how goodly are your tents, O Yaakov. So Rashi says, what does he mean by goodly are your tents? He says that each tent had a window or a door that would not open up facing the other, that there was privacy. And in fact, there's a whole section about if you have two existing houses, and the first person has a window, but he's facing a wall, you can't open up in your house that you have a window now looking into his house. You're right, there is such a thing as site pollution. People have the rights to privacy and things along those lines. Allocation of space. I'm going to now jump really fast because I see that I'm running out of time. Spent too much time. The second category of environment, I'll introduce it with the following. In Texas, there was a sheriff who started painting all of the prisons that he was in charge of pink. Now, why did he paint them pink? Not to punish. He noticed that when they would take drunks and they would throw them into the prison, they always got into fights with one another, and he noticed that if he painted it pink, they were calmed down as a result. So they call it drunk tank pink. It's actually a color. When you go to the hardware store and you need a certain type of pink, it's called drunk tank pink. And apparently it calms people down, so much so that there was a college football coach who read about this, and he painted the visitors' locker room. When the visitors come to play, he painted it all pink because they would then be sort of calmer when they went out and they would win. And actually, he got sued, and the league, the National College League, made him repaint, and that it can't be pink. It has to be different colors. Anyway, the idea is that certain environments influence how we feel. And that's the whole second category. Allocation of space is how we establish our cities, right? What all these sources begin to describe is the ideal city, the Levite city. It couldn't be too big. It can't have too big of a population. It can't have too small of a population. Every Levite city had to have a certain amount of water. It had to have a certain amount of trade, and because the environment that you're in, remember, cities, especially the cities of refuge, that's a different point. We'll come to it at some point in time. Were meant to rehabilitate criminals. They needed a certain environment. And then the Torah also describes the layout of these cities. There was fields around, there was a concentrated area of a city, and then there were fields all around that you were not allowed to change. You were not allowed to have crops there. You couldn't make it a farm. It was just for view. This is also related a little bit to Shlomo, what you're saying about views. The city itself had to have a view, and you were allowed to plant trees, but they had to be a certain distance so it didn't affect the wind that a person would feel, the breeze that you would feel, and the view that you would have. And the rabbis were very concerned that you shouldn't give up on this buffer, this green, what we call in the modern environmental thought, a green lung, where they would try to create parks around cities. The Torah already speaks about creating green lungs for cities, that it provided a certain quality of life, and that quality of life was important for the people. And not only that, Rav Hirsch has a beautiful statement on this, which also I think has a very sort of environmental undertones to it. He says that you are not allowed to change the nature of the city. You couldn't, if you ran out of space, you weren't all of a sudden allowed to, take from the green belt and put more buildings up there. You had to create a new city or go on the other side. And he says as follows: precisely because the city with open spaces, had been given to them for all generations, right? It's a gift from God. No generation is permitted to change it as it sees fit. The present generation is not the sole ruler over it, but future generations have equal rights, and each is required to bequeath it to future generations in the same state in which it was given to them. In other words, this ideal environment in which a person is supposed to live is going to create a certain type of person. There are studies that show, for example, depressed people who walk in greenery have much better improvement in their mental state, as opposed to, they did this where they had people walk in a mall or walk in an inside gym. Going outside, being in nature, being in the green, it helps them. And so this is the second element, I think, of Jewish environmentalism. One is that it's concerned about people, the people, your neighbors, but it's also sort of more global. It's also concerned about people you don't know, and concerned about future generations. and confirm it's concerned about quality of life. There's a value in the environment, and these two elements that we're talking about, people and environment, is going to bring us back to what I think is the real meaning of Baal Tashchit. So the last source, the last section, nature conservation. There's a whole series of sources related to nature conservation. You're not allowed to destroy anything. But is that really true that that the halacha says you're not allowed to destroy anything? By the way, anything. First of all, the way the rabbis understand destroying is very expansive. They say, for example, if you are able to eat a certain type of bread, and you end up using a more expensive type of bread, that's Baal Tashchit. You could have lived with something simpler, and now you got something fancy. Now, there's an argument about that. They say, well, no, when it comes to food, when it comes to your health, you're allowed to spend extra on yourself. So, for example, if you really have a preference for like organic food, you're allowed to spend extra on that. But you're not allowed to spend extra on anything, just because you like it. It gives example of oil, for example. When it comes to oil, if you were to like burn an oil faster than it normally is burned, you're not allowed to do that. That's also Baal Tashchit. Take it to do things. So there's a question about, for example, all the SUVs that are in America, these big vehicles. If you don't have a family of 5 or 6, there might be a problem with that of Baal Tashchit. If you're wasting gas and it's not for a purpose, you might be violating Baal Tashchit, yeah. So that's I think the real chiddush of Jewish environmental things. But what happens if it's for a mitzvah or for a value? What's a perfect example of that? What are we? Correct. So those are one set of examples to beautify our mitzvot. You can also see it in other things. Earlier on, with the Sefer Chinuch says you're not allowed to tear anything. You're not allowed to tear clothes. Do you have an example when you are allowed to? When you're in mourning. So how are you allowed to do that? Or I'll give you another example. Are you allowed to, at a wedding, we destroy a glass? Where do we get off destroying the glass? It's Baal Tashchit. So one of the answers offered, and this is the source on the back page, not this particular, but this idea in general. When you break the glass, what are you really doing? Is you're remembering Yerushalayim. You're recalling our connection to this place. And hopefully you're also being inspired to recommit yourself to the rebuilding of Yerushalayim. And so this is a destruction that really is a creation. Right? When a new couple is married and they rededicate themselves to building Yerushalayim and building the Jewish people and committing to the Jewish people, that's creation, not destruction. That's what this source on the second page is. Someone asked whether or not you're allowed to break down a fruit tree if it's harming other trees. And then in the discussion, the answer to it, the question is, are you allowed to break down a fruit tree if, for example, in order to build a house, you need to take down a tree? And all the calculations are what produces the greatest value, not financial value, but like greatest contribution to society at this point in time. So if, for example, you're going to build a house, that is more important than maybe having a fruit tree by itself. There are some who say, by the way, anyway, the fruit tree, you can never touch it. And if you really need to get rid of a fruit tree, you should make sure to have a non-Jew take it out because it says explicitly in the Torah. But others say, more or less, you're allowed to, you could probably replant it. But more or less, for example, if you have an old house, what right do you have to do a renovation? Again, if you're creating, and that's this last idea that I want to just end with, Baal Tashchit is not really, we understand that you're not allowed to destroy, but that's not what Tashchit is. If you look in the English, near the very end, it says Rav Hirsch. Rav Hirsch says, the second to last bullet point, Shachat is the conception of corruption, not destruction, right? When our politicians are corrupt, we call it shchitut. It's from shachat. It's not destruction. It's corruption. It's using something in a purpose that it wasn't designed to be used for. It is the overthrow of a good condition and impeding the progress and changing into the opposite of anything which was meant to thrive and prosper. Baal Tashchit is the prohibition against causing a net loss in quality, the degradation of useful resources without the commensurate benefit to compensate the loss. What is Rav Hirsch saying? So we started off by saying that Baal Tashchit is about making sure you don't destroy anything. But that's not what it's really about. Baal Tashchit is making sure that you use your resources in the most positive way possible. Very often, if you destroy resources, that's not a positive way. But this goes back to the points that I was making in the beginning. Jewish environmentalism is concerned about people. People change the entire equation. How so? If you look up here, this maybe gets a little scientific, but I find it as a good mashal, a good way of understanding this issue. The first and second law of thermodynamics. Energy can be converted from one form to another, but it cannot be created and cannot be destroyed. So that means anything we do in this world, we're very often transforming it or degrading that item, right? Because we are in a closed system. There's no new energies that are going to come forward. But there are some times when there is something from the outside. The sun, for example, produces new energy, right? If you look at just oil and gas, there's never going to be any more oil or gas. So every time you use oil, that's tashchit. You're destroying it. But that doesn't mean there can't be new energy in the world. There is new energy in the world because there's sun always coming in. Another thing that breaks this closed system is human beings. Human beings are creative. We can actually create new energies. It's not a zero-sum game where the world is always getting less and less and less and less pure. What's a perfect example of that? Tu B'Shvat. What do we do on Tu B'Shvat? We plant trees. The general concept of environmentalism is you can never improve the environment. You could just make sure not to destroy it too much. That's the general modern secular environmental ethic. You have to be always very, very careful. And Judaism, by and large, respects that idea. But we go a step further. We say human beings actually have an additional obligation, because we're created in the image of God. We can actually make the situation better. Not just not be wasteful, but we can actually create and produce. What's a great example of that? The Negev, or Israel in general. Israel is the only country in the world that has produced more trees in the 20th century rather than lost trees. Every other country around the world has lost trees in the 20th century. Israel is the only one that has grown. Without human involvement, there would not be a reproduction of trees at the same level. But because we stepped in, we're actually able to produce a better situation. So if we look at Baal Tashchit as not just not destroying, but really an obligation of creating in the most ideal form. That's why you're allowed to break that glass, because that form of destruction is actually creating. Planting a tree, you're actually creating. You're actually creating a better situation than before. So the one thing I want to leave you with in terms of Jewish environmentalism is, in many respects, we're very similar to the general environmental movement. But we have a focus more so, I think, on the role of human beings. You see that with Hilchot Shchenim. We're concerned about the ethical elements of it, not just the environment by itself. It's how we relate to other people, how we relate to other generations, and how we relate to God. I left out some of the sources, how you would see God in the beautiful environment. And finally, it's ultimately about creating and using our creativity to be, right, most of the mitzvot we've seen. If you remember back, all the mitzvot we've gone over through Pirkei, through the very beginning, through the Sefer Chinuch, one of the themes that exists is the role of the human being is to be B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God, and in Matati Yodeo, to be like God in some way. So even this mitzvah Baal Tashchit, it's really about how can we be like God, and in that sense, our connection with the environment is how to use the environment in such a way as to create more value in the world as opposed to less. Have a good Tu B'Shvat. Yeah.
Because in the beginning, God commands us, who are who, to like ours. He says, fill up the world. As we're doing this, in order to make room, we're cutting down forests, we're moving habitats, and it's inevitable that it's going to happen, like in Jerusalem
Keep producing, right.
They need houses and they need more materials, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big
It is a conflict, but if humans were not, listen, humans are both the cause of all problems and usually the cause of the solutions. I'll give you one quick example. But you're right, it is a challenge. But we also are creating new ways of, like, if you think about food, for example, we haven't solved what to do with all these trees. Although I would actually say Israel does a good job of it because it's constantly has very good forest management. But you know, what Malthausen, right? He was always concerned that we're going to run out of food. We've actually produced technology to produce more food at a greater rate than the number of people who entered into the world. So there's not actually a food scarcity. Today there should be a food scarcity because there was almost a food scarcity 1,000 years ago. And now we have 100 times the number of people. I'm making that up. I don't know the exact numbers. But we actually, whatever the case may be. Let me just end with this. Israel is, I think, a great model in this regard for many different things. I may have told this story once before, but it's such a creative way. There was a professor who had this idea. He looked at what industry is the worst contributor to greenhouse emissions. And it happens to be that it's the cement business. To create cement, you produce a tremendous amount of environmental waste. And so he had this idea that you could create pavement from what is it, coral reef. By corals are animals that basically create an exoskeleton that it's just as hard, and you can take it and you can manufacture corals. You put them in like a shipping container. You start the seed. You put only a few. You put it under the water, and they'll naturally produce, and they'll then create a block of cement, but without producing any type of environmental impact whatsoever. So he actually started to sell this business to some VC people. They liked it. They started doing the same thing. They think it's great. It's going to diminish. And he then went to some other investors and he says, listen, we can actually make it much faster. We can produce, it takes us, I don't know the exact amounts. It takes us, 6 months to produce a shipping container by natural production. If you could somehow get me, do you think any company would be willing to sell me carbon dioxide? If any company would sell me carbon dioxide, I could do it in a sixth of the time. We could do it in 1 month. And the people said to him, are you crazy? Because this is what they need in order to reproduce. We don't have to buy it. There are companies that are fined if they have too much carbon dioxide. They will pay you to take the carbon dioxide. And so in fact, that's what they did. They now take carbon dioxide, they get paid for it, and it now produces this exoskeleton coral reef much faster. So this is a win-win-win-win for everyone. And I kind of see this as a model that human beings should be striving for in a whole series of different industries. In America today, immigration is the worst thing in the world. But if you talk to Israelis, right, immigration, right, Jewish law of return, is part of our savior. Israel is able to be built on immigration. We look at desert, and people say it's a wasteland. Israel is able to transform it into the production of all these technologies that have to do with growing trees better and faster and all these things along. The army is another good example. It's terrible that you have to have an army, but from this army has come all this other technology. You can take your waste, and if you're smart enough, you can figure out how it can actually not just get you back to even, it can actually get you much higher above. So we haven't solved the problem, though you're right, about the trees and the Amazon rainforest. But given enough time, human beings should be creative enough to transform that problem into a positive. I don't know how. That's for people much smarter than me. But that's what I think Judaism or Baal Tashchit is trying to encourage us to do.